the cursed forest, and the fear of the unknown. The village of Elderglen lay nestled in a valley, its crooked stone cottages huddled together like old friends reluctant to part. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with the damp earth. Yet, despite the warmth of the hearths and the comfort of familiar faces, a shadow lingered over the village, an unspoken fear that no one dared to name. It was the forest that loomed at the edge of Elderglen, a vast and ancient expanse of trees that had stood long before the village was ever built. The villagers called it the Blackwood, a name whispered in hushed tones, for they believed it to be cursed. Legends told of a time when the Blackwood had been a place of wonder, where the trees whispered secrets to those who listened, and the rivers sang lullabies to the stars. But that was before the first tree had withered, before the first animal had vanished without a trace. Now the Blackwood was a place of silence, where even the wind dared not pass without a shudder. The trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky as if in supplication or warning. The villagers spoke of strange lights flickering in the distance, of the air thick with an unnatural stillness, and of the deep guttural growls that echoed through the woods at night. No one dared to venture into the Blackwood, not even the bravest of the village hunters. The elders warned that the forest was alive in a way that defied understanding, that it had a will of its own, and that those who entered it never returned the same. Some said the forest was a punishment, a consequence of sins long forgotten. Others believed it was a guardian, a force that protected something sacred and untouchable. Whatever the truth, the villagers lived in fear, their lives shaped by the unrelenting presence of the Blackwood. Yet, despite the warnings and the fear, there was one among them who could not ignore the pull of the forest. A young woman named Elara, with eyes that seemed to see beyond the veil of the ordinary, felt an inexplicable connection to the Blackwood. She had always been different, a child of the village who listened to the wind and the rustling of leaves as if they were speaking to her. And though the others feared the forest, Elara could not help but wonder what lay beyond. Its shadowed depths. Elara and the whispering forest. Elara had always been an outsider in Elderglen, a girl who moved through the world with a quiet intensity that unsettled those around her. While the other children played by the river or chased fireflies through the meadows, she would sit for hours beneath the village's oldest tree, her fingers tracing the bark as if listening for something only she could hear. The elders watched her with wary eyes, murmuring about the old tales of those who had been taken by the forest, and the mothers warned their children not to speak to her, lest they be cursed by the same fate. Yet Elara never flinched at their words. She did not fear the Blackwood. She felt it as if it were a part of her, a presence that called to her in the way the wind called to the trees. The villagers whispered that she was cursed, that the Blackwood had marked her in some way that no one else could understand. Some believed she was the child of the forest itself, born from the roots that had long been hidden beneath the earth. Others claimed she had been touched by the same darkness that had corrupted the trees, that she carried within her the same strange power that made the Blackwood so feared. But Elara did not care about their fears. She had never known a life without the forest, and though the others shunned it, she felt drawn to its depths, as if it were a part of her soul. She had tried to explain it to the village healer, who had only shaken her head, and muttered about old magic and things that should not be. She had tried to speak to her father, who had only looked at her with sorrow, and said that some things were not meant to be understood. And so she had kept her silence, walking the edge of the Blackwood with eyes that saw more than the others could. She did not know what lay beyond the trees, but she knew that something was waiting for her, something that only she could find. The call of the Blackwood. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold, Elara stood at the edge of the Blackwood. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and something older, something that had not been touched by time. The trees loomed before her, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers, and the wind carried a whisper that was not quite a voice but something deeper, something that called to her. She had always known the forest would one day pull her in, but now, with the weight of the villagers' fear pressing against her, she felt the pull more than ever. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the soft soil as the shadows lengthened around her. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of unseen creatures and the creak of ancient trees swaying in a wind that did not touch the village. She moved carefully, her breath shallow, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. The Blackwood was no longer just a place of legend. It was real, and it was watching her. The deeper she ventured, the more the air thickened, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their leaves dark and brittle. The light from the fading sun struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest in a perpetual twilight. She could hear the wind whispering through the branches, not in a voice, but in a language that was just beyond her understanding. It was not threatening, but it was not welcoming either. It was waiting. Then the first sign of the forest sentience appeared. A low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, a sound that did not belong to any creature she had ever known. It was not the growl of a wolf or the snarl of a beast. It was something older, something that had not been. Born of the world she knew. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and the forest seemed to shift around her as if it had heard her fear and was now aware of her presence. She turned, but there was no path back. The trees had closed in, their branches weaving together like the fingers of a giant, forming a wall of shadows that blocked the way she had come. The whispering wind grew louder, and for a moment she thought she heard a voice, her own voice, speaking in a language she did not recognize. It was not a voice of command, but of invitation. The forest was not just alive, it was aware, and it was testing her. She took a step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, and the forest answered. The ground beneath. Her feet trembled, and the trees groaned as if in pain. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a scent that was not of the earth, something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries. The Blackwood was not just a place of fear, it was a place of power, and it was waiting for her to choose what she would do next. Into the heart of the Blackwood Elara pressed forward, her breath shallow as the forest seemed to shift around her, the trees bending and swaying as if they were alive. The whispering wind grew louder, not in a voice, but in a language that was just beyond her understanding. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were testing her, waiting for her to falter. But she did not stop. She had come too far, and the pull of the Blackwood was stronger than the fear that had gripped her heart. As she moved deeper into the forest, the light from the sun was gone, replaced by an eerie luminescence that seemed to come from the trees themselves. The bark of the trunks glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly blue light that illuminated the twisted roots and gnarled branches. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but beneath it there was something else, something sweet and ancient, like the memory of a long-forgotten dream. She could feel the forest watching her, not with malice, but with curiosity, as if it had been waiting for someone to come. Then she saw them. The corrupted trees. They stood at the edge of a clearing, their trunks blackened and cracked, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. They were not dead, but something had taken hold of them, something that had twisted their forms into grotesque imitations of life. The leaves that clung to their branches were not green, but a sickly red, as if they had been burned from within. Elara stepped forward, her heart pounding, and the trees groaned in response. She could hear them now, the whispers of the wind that had once been just beyond her understanding. They were not just voices. They were thoughts, fragments of something ancient and vast that had been buried deep within the forest. The trees were not merely trees. They were something more, something that had been waiting for her to come. The wind carried with it a voice, not one that belonged to any human, but one that was older, deeper, and more powerful than anything she had ever known. It was not a voice of warning, but of invitation. The forest was not just alive, it was sentient, and it was calling to her. Elara took a step forward, her fingers brushing against the bark of one of the corrupted trees. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy coursed through her, a sensation that was not painful, but overwhelming. It was as if the forest was speaking to her, not in words, but in emotions, fear, sorrow, longing. She could feel the pain of the trees, the way they had been twisted and corrupted by something beyond her understanding. And in that moment she knew that the Blackwood was not just a place of fear, it was a place of power, and it was waiting for her to choose what she would do next. The whispering wind grew louder, and the trees around her seemed to shift, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something that had been waiting in the shadows for a long time. The forest was not just alive, it was aware, and it was testing her. And as she stood there, surrounded by the corrupted trees and the whispering wind, she realized that the forest's secret. Elara's fingers trembled as she pressed her palm against the bark of the corrupted tree, feeling the pulse of something ancient and unknowable. The whispering wind carried a voice that was not quite a voice that was not quite a voice, but a thought. And as she stood there, surrounded by the corrupted trees and the whispering wind, she realized that like the tide against a shore. She could not understand the words, but she could feel their meaning, pain, sorrow, and a desperate plea. The forest was not merely a place of fear. It was a being, a vast and ancient entity that had been wounded, twisted, and corrupted by something beyond her understanding. She took a step back, her breath shallow, and the trees groaned in response. The corrupted trees were not dead, but something had taken hold of them, something that had twisted their forms into grotesque imitations of life. She had always believed the Blackwood to be cursed, but now she saw the truth. It was not cursed by the village, nor by the fear of the villagers. It was cursed by something else, something that had been buried deep within the forest, something that had been waiting for her to come. As she moved deeper into the clearing, the air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a scent that was not of the earth. It was something older, something that had been hidden for centuries. The trees around her seemed to shift, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something that had been waiting for her to come. Then she saw it. At the center of the clearing, half buried in the earth, was a tree unlike any she had ever seen. Its trunk was blackened and twisted, its branches reaching out like the fingers of a long-dead thing. But what caught her breath was the light that emanated from it. It was not the sickly red of the corrupted trees, nor the pale blue of the other trees in the forest. It was a light that pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, as if it were alive. And then the whispering wind spoke again. Not in words, but in a feeling, a memory that was not her own. She saw a vision of a time long before the village had been built, before the trees had been twisted and corrupted. She saw a great forest, vast and unbroken, where the trees had stood tall and proud, and the rivers had sung songs to the stars. She saw the people who had lived among them, not as conquerors, but as part of the forest, as one with the earth. And then she saw the change. A great darkness had come, a force that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. She could not see the source, but she could feel its presence, a force that had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. Elara stumbled back, her heart pounding. The Blackwood was not just a place of fear. It was a place of power, and it had been waiting for her to come. She had always felt the pull of the forest, but now she understood. The Blackwood was not cursed. It was wounded, and it was waiting for someone to heal it. But what did that mean for her? She looked around, her breath shallow, and realized that the choice was hers. She could leave, return to the village, and pretend that she had never seen the truth. Or she could stay, and face whatever awaited her in the heart of the Blackwood. The whispering wind carried the voice once more, and this time she understood. The forest was not just alive, it was waiting for her to decide what she would do next. The battle for the Blackwood. Elara stood at the heart of the clearing, her breath shallow, her heart pounding with the weight of the revelation that had been placed before her. The forest was not just cursed, it was wounded, and it had been waiting for her to come. The whispering wind carried the voice once more, and this time she understood. The Blackwood was not a place of fear. It was a place of power, and it had been waiting for someone to heal it. But the forest was not passive. It had been waiting, yes, but it had also been watching. And now it was testing her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the corrupted trees groaned as if in pain. The whispering wind grew louder, carrying with it a sound that was not a voice, but a presence that pressed against her mind. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were trying to force her to leave. But she did not move. The tree at the center of the clearing pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, and the air around it thickened with an energy that was neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely. Elara stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the bark once more. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy coursed through her, and she gasped as the world around her seemed to shift. The forest was speaking to her, not in words, but in emotions: fear, sorrow, longing. She could feel the pain of the trees, the way they had been twisted and corrupted by something beyond her understanding. And in that moment she knew that the Blackwood was not just a place of power. It was a place of suffering, and it was waiting for her to choose what she would do next. The whispering wind carried a new voice, one that was not just a presence, but a challenge. The forest was not simply waiting for her to heal it. It was waiting for her to fight for it. The ground beneath her feet trembled again, and the corrupted trees groaned as if in warning. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a scent that was not of the earth, something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something that had been waiting for her to come. Then the forest moved. The trees around her shifted, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. The ground beneath her feet cracked, and the air grew thick with the scent of something old and forgotten. The whispering wind carried a voice that was not her own, but one that had been waiting for her to hear. Elara took a step back, her heart pounding. The forest was not just alive. It was aware, and it was testing her. She could feel the presence of the force that had corrupted the Blackwood, something that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. It was not a being, not in the way that humans understood. It was a force, a presence that had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. And now, she was that someone. The whispering wind carried the voice once more, and this time she understood. The forest was not just waiting for her to heal it, it was waiting for her to fight for it. Elara closed her eyes, and for the first time she did not feel fear. She felt something else. Determination. She was not just a girl from the village. She was something else. She was the one who had been chosen to stand against the force that had corrupted the Black. The healing of the... Blackwood Elara opened her eyes, and the whispering wind carried with it a new voice, one that was not of the forest, but of her own heart. She had spent her life listening to the wind, to the rustling of leaves, to the hushed whispers of the trees. And now she understood. The Blackwood was not just a place of fear, nor was it merely a force of nature. It was a living thing, a vast and ancient entity that had been wounded, twisted, and corrupted by something beyond her understanding. And now she was the one who had been chosen to heal it. She took a step forward, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. The corrupted trees groaned in response, their branches shifting as if in anticipation. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it the scent of something ancient and forgotten. But Elara did not falter. She had come too far, and the forest had tested her, waiting for her to choose what she would do next. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the bark of the corrupted tree. The moment her skin made contact, a surge of energy coursed through her, and she gasped as the world around her shifted. She could feel the pain of the trees, the way they had been twisted and corrupted by the force that had taken hold of them. She could feel the sorrow, the longing, the desperate plea for help. And then she understood. The Blackwood was not simply a place of power. It was a place of suffering, and it had been waiting for someone to heal it. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she did not feel fear. She felt something else. Determination. She reached deeper, her fingers pressing against the bark, and the forest responded. The whispering wind grew louder, and the trees around her shifted, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. The air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. Then the force that had corrupted the Blackwood rose. It was not a being, not in the way that humans understood. It was a presence, a force that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. And now Elara was that someone. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a voice. That was not her own. It was the voice of the force that had corrupted the Blackwood, a voice that was not of the forest, but of something else entirely. Elara took a step forward, and the force of the forest answered. She could feel the presence of the force pressing against her, a force that had been waiting for someone to come. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were testing her, waiting for her to choose what she would do next. And then she did. She reached deeper, her fingers pressing against the bark, and the forest responded. The whispering wind grew louder, and the trees around her shifted, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. The air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. Then the force that had corrupted the Blackwood rose. It was not a being, not in the way that humans understood. It was a presence, a force that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. And now Elara was that someone. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a voice that was not her own. It was the voice of the force that had corrupted the Blackwood, a voice that was not of the forest, but of something else entirely. Elara took a step forward, and the force of the forest answered. She could feel the presence of the force pressing against her, a force that had been waiting for someone to come. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were testing her, waiting for her to choose what she would do next. And then she did. She reached deeper, her fingers pressing against the bark, and the forest responded. The whispering wind grew louder, and the trees around her shifted, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. The air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. Then the force that had corrupted the Blackwood rose. It was not a being, not in the way that humans understood. It was a presence, a force that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. And now the air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. Then the force that had corrupted the Blackwood rose. Elara was that someone. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a voice that was not her own. It was the voice of the force that had corrupted the Blackwood, a voice that was not of the forest, but of something else entirely. Elara took a step forward, and the force of the forest answered. She could feel the presence of the force pressing against her, a force that had been waiting for someone to come. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were testing her, waiting for her to choose what she would do next. And then she did. She reached deeper, her fingers pressing against the bark, and the forest responded. The whispering wind grew louder, and the trees around her shifted, their branches moving as if they were reaching for her. The air thickened with energy, and the ground beneath her feet trembled with a slow, steady rhythm. Then the force that had corrupted the blackwood rose. It was not a being, not in the way that humans understood. It was a presence, a force that had twisted the trees and corrupted the land. It had been waiting for someone to come, someone who could understand. And now Alara was that someone. The air grew colder, and the whispering wind carried with it a voice that was not her own. It was the voice of the force that had corrupted the blackwood, a voice that was not of the forest, but of something else entirely. Alara took a step forward, and the force of the forest answered. She could feel the presence of the force pressing against her, a force that had been waiting for someone to come. She could feel the weight of the forest pressing against her, as if it were testing her, waiting for her to choose what she would do next. And then she did. The balance between man and nature. Alara stood at the heart of the blackwood, the whispering wind carrying with it the weight of all that had transpired. The trees had shifted, their branches no longer twisted in agony but reaching toward the sky, as if in quiet gratitude. The air was no longer thick with the scent of decay, but instead it was filled with something ancient and pure, a presence that had been waiting for someone to understand. She had come to the blackwood, not as a conqueror, but as a bridge between two forces, man and nature. And in that moment she saw the truth of the world, not as a battle, but as a delicate balance. The blackwood had not been cursed by the village, nor had it been the result of some ancient sin. It had been wounded, twisted by a force that had sought to dominate rather than coexist. The villagers had feared the forest, and in their fear they had turned away from it, leaving it to wither in silence. But Alara had not been afraid. She had listened. She had felt the pain of the trees, the sorrow of the land, and in doing so she had found a way to heal what had been broken. The whispering wind carried with it a voice that was not of the forest, but of something deeper, something that had always been there, waiting for someone to understand. The world was not a place of dominion, nor was it a place of submission. It was a place of harmony, of coexistence. And in that realization, Alara saw the reflection of her own journey. She had not come to the blackwood to fight, but to listen. And in doing so, she had found a way to restore what had been lost. The trees around her swayed gently, their leaves rustling as if in a soft, contented sigh. The air was no longer heavy with the weight of the past, but light with the promise of the future. The blackwood was no longer a place of fear, but of understanding. And Alara, standing at its heart, knew that she had not only healed the forest, but had also changed herself. The villagers would return, and they would see the blackwood not as a place of curse, but as a place of power. They would see that the forest was not an enemy, but a part of the world that had been waiting for someone to listen. And perhaps in time they would understand what she had come to know, that the world was not meant to be conquered, but to be lived in harmony with. As the wind carried the final whisper of the forest, Alara closed her eyes and let the moment settle around her. She was no longer just a girl from the village. She was something more. She was a part of the world, and the world was a part of her. And in that moment she knew that the balance between man and nature had been restored, not through force, but through understanding. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it. A World on the Brink. The village of Elderglen lay nestled in a valley, its thatched rooftops huddled together like children afraid of the dark. It was a place where the past clung to the present with a stubborn, unyielding grip, and where the whispers of old gods still echoed through the trees. The land around it was vast and untamed, a wild expanse of ancient forests, rolling hills, and rivers that seemed to hum with a life of their own. The people of Elderglen had long lived in uneasy harmony with the land, respecting its power but never truly understanding it. They told stories of the forest that watched them, of the wind that carried voices not their own, and of the sky that sometimes turned the color of blood. But now something was changing. The forest, once a place of quiet mystery, had begun to stir. The trees, which had stood for centuries, now seemed to shift in the moonlight, their branches reaching out as if in search of something. The wind no longer carried only the voices of the past. It carried something else, something new and strange. And the sky, once a canvas of stars and shifting clouds, had taken on a color that no one could name. It was a color that made the villagers pause, that made them glance over their shoulders, as if expecting something to step out from the shadows. The elders spoke of an old prophecy, one that had been buried in the annals of time. They said that when the sky turned to an unfamiliar hue and the forest awoke from its slumber, the balance of the world would be tested. Some believed it was a sign of the end, others of a new beginning, but no one could say for certain. All they knew was that the world around them was changing, and with it the fate of Elderglen. And in the heart of the village, where the trees met the earth and the sky met the clouds, a single light flickered in the distance. It was a light that had not been seen in generations, a light that pulsed like a heartbeat, as if the land itself had found its voice again. It was a sign, a warning, or perhaps the beginning of something far greater than any of them could comprehend. The time of quiet had passed, and the world was waking. The time of quiet had passed. In the heart of Elderglen, where the village streets twisted like the roots of the ancient trees, lived a man named Elias Thorn. He was not a man of great renown, nor did he seek the attention of the village elders or the whispers of the villagers. He was a woodcarver, a man who spent his days shaping the trunks of fallen trees into delicate figures and intricate symbols. His hands, calloused and weathered, bore the marks of a lifetime spent in the embrace of the forest, and his eyes, deep and knowing, seemed to see beyond the surface of things. Elias was not a man of war or power, but he carried within him a quiet strength, a bond with the land that few could understand. Elias had always felt the pull of the forest, a call that had begun in his childhood, when he was just a boy wandering through the trees with his father, who had told him stories of the old gods and the spirits that dwelled within the roots of the world. He had always believed that the forest was more than just a place of trees and animals. It was a living thing, a presence that watched and waited. And though he had never spoken of it aloud, he had always felt that the forest was watching him in return. But now, as the sky turned to an unfamiliar hue and the trees stirred with a strange energy, Elias felt something within him shift. The forest was no longer just a place of quiet mystery. It was something else, something that had been waiting for this moment. He could feel it in the air, in the way. The wind carried voices that were not his own, in the way the trees seemed to lean toward him as if listening. He had always believed that the forest was alive, but now he was beginning to wonder if it was awake. And with that awakening came a question that had haunted him for years. What was the forest trying to tell him? He had spent his life in its embrace, carving its stories into wood, but now he was beginning to feel as though the stories were no longer his to tell. The forest had something to say, and he was afraid that he was the only one who could hear it. Yet, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind, Elias knew that he could not turn away. The forest had always been a part of him, and now, as the world around him changed, he felt the weight of something greater pressing upon him. He did not know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The forest was no longer silent, and he would have to find a way to listen. The forest awakens. The first signs of the forest's awakening were subtle, almost imperceptible to those who did not know what to look for. The trees, which had stood unmoving for centuries, began to shift. Their branches, once rigid and unyielding, now swayed with a strange, deliberate grace, as if they were dancing to an unseen rhythm. The leaves, which had always been a deep emerald, began to shimmer with an iridescent sheen, catching the light in ways that defied the natural order. And the wind, which had long carried only the whispers of the past, now carried something new, a voice that was not human, not animal, but something else entirely. At first the people of Elderglen dismissed these changes as the work of the seasons, a natural shift in the balance of the world. But as the days passed, the signs became more pronounced. The river that ran through the village, once a gentle stream that reflected the sky, turned dark and sluggish, its waters thick with an unknown substance that clung to the rocks and the banks. The animals, too, began to behave strangely. Birds that had once sung in the morning now fell silent. Their songs were replaced by an eerie, low hum that seemed to emanate from the trees themselves. Even the insects, which had always been a constant presence in the air, now vanished, as if the forest had decided that they were no longer welcome. The villagers, who had long lived in uneasy harmony with the land, began to feel the weight of their own ignorance. The elders, who had spent their lives studying the old ways, spoke of omens and warnings, of the time when the forest had turned against the people who had forgotten its name. They told of the first awakening, a time when the trees had risen in anger and the sky had turned to blood, when the village had been forced to kneel and offer its prayers to the forest in the hope that it would spare them. But now, with the sky once again taking on that unnatural hue and the forest stirring once more, the elders could not say whether this was a new beginning or a return to the past. Fear took root in the hearts of the villagers. Some believed that the forest had grown angry, that the people of Elderglen had disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed. Others whispered of a prophecy, of a time when the forest would rise once more and claim the land for itself, when the trees would walk and the rivers would speak. There were those who called for the village to be abandoned, to flee before the forest could take them all. But others, those who still remembered the old ways, refused to leave, believing that the only way to survive was to understand the forest's will, to listen to the voices that now carried through the trees. And in the midst of this uncertainty, one voice rose above the rest. A figure, cloaked in shadows and wrapped in the scent of ancient wood, stepped from the trees and into the village square. They did not speak at first, only standing there, their presence a challenge to the people who had long believed themselves the masters of the land. When they finally spoke, their voice was like the wind, like the rustling of leaves, like the whisper of the river. They did not demand, nor did they command. They simply asked, "Why have you forgotten the forest? Why have you turned your backs on the land that gave you life?" The villagers, who had always believed themselves to be the ones in control, found themselves at a loss. They had not forgotten the forest, not entirely, but they had forgotten its will, its power, its presence. And now, as the forest awoke once more, they would have to decide whether they would stand against it or bend to its will, the struggle for survival. The forest's awakening was not a mere shift in the natural order, it was a reckoning. The people of Elderglen, who had long believed themselves the masters of the land, now found themselves at the mercy of forces they could not understand. The trees, once passive sentinels of the landscape, now moved with purpose, their roots rising from the earth like serpents, their branches reaching out as if to grasp at the villagers who had forgotten their place. The wind, which had once carried the songs of the past, now howled with a voice that was not their own, a voice that spoke of forgotten oaths and broken promises. The river, once a source of life, now ran black with something that should not have been, its waters thick with an unknown substance that clung to the stones and the banks. The villagers, once confident in their dominion over the land, now found themselves in a desperate struggle for survival. Some called for action, for the village to be abandoned before the forest could consume them all. Others, those who still clung to the old ways, argued that the only path forward was to understand the forest's will, to listen to the voices that now carried through the trees. But in the face of the growing chaos, few had the strength to listen, and even fewer had the will to act. Elias Thorn, who had always felt the pull of the forest, now found himself caught between two worlds. He was not a man of war, nor a leader of the people, but he could not ignore the signs that the forest was sending. He had spent his life shaping the wood of the trees, carving their stories into the very fabric of the village, but now he was beginning to see that the stories were no longer his to tell. The forest had something to say, and he was the only one who could hear it. Yet, even as he tried to understand the forest's message, he was plagued by doubt. What if the forest was not offering guidance but warning? What if it was not trying to speak, but to destroy? He had always believed that the forest was a place of quiet mystery, but now it was something else entirely. Something vast and unknowable. Something that had been waiting for this moment. And he, a simple woodcarver, was the only one who could hear it. The village, too, was changing. The people who had once lived in harmony with the land now found themselves at odds with it, their lives upended by the forces that had once been their allies. The elders, who had spent their lives studying the old ways, now found themselves at a loss, their knowledge no longer enough to explain the strange and terrible things that were happening. The younger villagers, who had never known a time when the forest had not been a place of quiet mystery, now looked to Elias with a mixture of fear and hope, as if he was the only one who could bridge the gap between the past and the future. And so, as the forest continued to stir and the sky took on a color that no one could name, the people of Elderglen stood at a crossroads. The world had changed, and they would have to decide whether they would fight against it or find a way to live within it. But for Elias, the choice was not his to make. The forest had already made its decision, and it was waiting for him to listen. Into the heart of the forest. Elias knew that if he was to understand the forest's will, he would have to go where no one else dared, to the heart of the forest itself. It was not a place that could be found on any map, nor was it marked by any known path. The trees there were ancient, their trunks twisted with time, their roots entwined in a way that made the very ground seem to breathe. It was a place that had always been a mystery, a place where the whispers of the wind carried more than just the voices of the past. And now, as the forest awoke once more, Elias felt that it was the only place left where he could find the answers he sought. He set out at dawn, the sky still heavy with the strange color that had become the mark of the forest's awakening. The village watched him go, some with fear, others with hope. He did not look back. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. The trees, which had once been silent sentinels, now seemed to watch him as he passed, their branches shifting in ways that defied the natural order. The wind, which had always carried the voices of the past, now carried something new, something that felt like a whisper in his ear, a voice that was not his own. The journey was not easy. The forest, which had once been a place of quiet mystery, now tested him in ways he had never imagined. The ground beneath his feet was no longer solid, but shifting, as if the land itself was alive and moving in response to his presence. The trees, which had once stood unmoving, now seemed to reach for him, their branches stretching toward him as if to draw him deeper into the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries and was now rising once more. And yet Elias did not turn back. He pressed on, his hands outstretched, as if to feel the pulse of the forest itself. He had always believed that the forest was a living thing, but now he was beginning to understand that it was not just a place, it was a presence, a force that had been waiting for this moment. He could feel it in the way the trees moved, in the way the wind carried voices that were not his own, in the way the ground beneath his feet seemed to shift in response to his every step. As he walked deeper into the heart of the forest, the whispers grew louder, until they were no longer just voices in the wind, but something more, something that felt like a challenge, a test. The forest was not asking him to listen, but to understand. And in that moment, Elias realized that the journey was not just about finding answers, it was about finding himself, the forest's judgment. Elias stood at the center of the ancient grove, where the trees were so old that their trunks bore the marks of time itself. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something older, something that had been buried beneath the roots for centuries. The wind, which had once carried only the whispers of the past, now carried something else, something that felt like a question, a demand. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing upon him, as if it was waiting for him to speak, to answer the unspoken challenge that had been laid before him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he did not feel fear. He felt something else, something that had always been there, waiting for him to listen. The forest was not just a place of mystery, it was a being, a force that had been watching, waiting, and now it was speaking. He could hear it in the rustling of the leaves, in the way the roots of the trees shifted beneath his feet, in the way the wind carried voices that were not his own. The forest had always been a part of him, but now it was asking something of him, not for power, not for control, but for understanding. He had spent his life shaping the wood of the trees, carving their stories into the very fabric of the village, but now he saw that the stories were not his to tell. The forest had a will of its own, and it had been waiting for the moment. Not his own, but that had been waiting for him to see. He saw the village of Elderglen, not as it was now, but as it had been in the past. He saw the people who had once lived in harmony with the land, who had listened to the forest's whispers and had understood its will. He saw the trees that had once been silent, but now spoke with voices that had been forgotten. And he saw the moment when the balance had been broken, when the people had turned their backs on the forest and had begun to take more than they had given. And then he saw the consequences. The trees had grown restless, their roots had risen from the earth, their branches had reached for the sky. The river had turned black, its waters thick with something that should not have been. The wind had carried voices that were not their own, voices that had been waiting for the people to listen. And now the forest was asking him to choose, to restore the balance or to let it fall into ruin. He did not know if he was ready, but he knew one thing for certain: he had no choice. The forest was waiting for his answer, a new harmony. Elias stood at the heart of the forest, the weight of the moment pressing upon him. He had always known that the forest was a living thing, that it had a will of its own, but now he understood that it was not a force to be feared or fought. It was a presence that had been waiting, watching, and now it, a promise. And then the forest moved. The trees, which had once stood unmoving, now shifted, their roots retracting from the ground, their branches relaxing as if they had been waiting for this moment. The river, which had once been black with something unknown, now ran clear once more, its waters reflecting the sky in a way that had not been seen in generations. The wind, which had once carried voices that were not their own, now carried the songs of the past, but with a new harmony, a new understanding. The village of Elderglen, which had once stood on the edge of the forest, now found itself in the center of something new. The people who had once feared the forest, who had once believed themselves to be its masters, now found themselves in a place where they could no longer claim dominion over the land. The forest had not been conquered, nor had it been destroyed. It had simply been waiting for the people to understand that they were not its enemies, but its partners. Elias, who had once been a simple woodcarver, now stood as a bridge between the two worlds. He had spent his life shaping the wood of the trees, carving their stories into the very fabric of the village. But now he saw that the stories were not his to tell. The forest had a will of its own, and it was not something that could be controlled or tamed. It was something that had to be understood, something that had to be listened to. And so, as the sun rose over the village, the people of Elderglen looked upon the forest with new eyes. They no longer saw it as a place of mystery, of fear, of something to be conquered. They saw it as something alive, something that had been waiting for them to listen. And in that moment they understood that the balance had been restored, not through force, not through destruction, but through understanding. And as the wind carried the whispers of the forest once more, Elias knew that the journey was not over. It was only beginning. The whisper of the forest. As the sun rose over the village of Elderglen, the forest seemed to exhale, its ancient breath settling into the land once more. The trees, which had once stood in silent defiance, now swayed gently in the morning breeze, their leaves catching the light in a way that had not been seen in generations. The river, once dark and thick with something unknown, now ran clear, its waters reflecting the sky with a quiet reverence. The wind, which had carried voices not their own, now carried the songs of the past with a new harmony, a new understanding. Elias stood at the edge of the village, his hands resting against the bark of a tree that had watched over the land for centuries. He had always believed that the forest was a place of mystery, a place where the past whispered through the leaves and the wind carried the voices of those who had come before. But now he understood that the forest was not just a place. It was a presence, a force that had been waiting for the people of Elderglen to listen. The villagers, who had once feared the forest, now looked upon it with a new kind of reverence. They no longer saw it as something to be conquered, something to be tamed. They saw it as something that had been waiting for them to understand, to listen, to find a way to live in harmony with the land that had given them life. And in that moment they realized that the balance had not been broken. It had simply been waiting for them to find their way back to it. The forest had always been a part of them, and now they were a part of it. The trees, which had once stood in silence, now seemed to whisper to the people who had once feared them, their voices carried on the wind like the stories of old. And in the heart of the village, where the trees met the earth and the sky met the clouds, the light of the sun shone through the leaves, a symbol of a new beginning. Elias closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the forest beneath his feet, the weight of its presence pressing gently against him. He had spent his life shaping the wood of the trees, carving their stories into the very fabric of the village, but now he saw that the stories were not his to tell. The forest had a will of its own, and it had always been waiting for the people to listen. And as the wind carried the whispers of the forest once more, Elias knew that the journey was not over. It was only beginning. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.